Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages. Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for car insurance can be? Visit Progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life, on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
In 2012, a New York school superintendent didn't show up as expected at a conference. His brother, a former FBI agent, suspected the worst, and he was right. The police had leads, and it took just one tip to bring it all together. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. Before we get started, I just want to send a general thank you to those who provided me with positive feedback on the last episode about Lita Files. I have passed that on to her daughter, and we will bring you updates in the case as things progress. Doing a different format than I usually do was a good exercise for those skills in crafting a story and constructing an episode around interviews, and the editing process with that is so different than what I usually do here on Crimelines. So it was nice to know that I can still do those things, but we are back to our usual format today and for the foreseeable future. And the case we are covering today is one that I saw a few years ago on a TV show, See No Evil, and it stuck with me. It has been covered on a few other shows, including Dateline, so it might even be one you're familiar with. We are going to start with Keith Reed, who was born in June of 1961 in New York, in that area right near the Pennsylvania border. For his career, Keith went into education, and he enjoyed teaching, but he really wanted to work as a principal, so he got a second master's degree in administration. He started teaching in 1984, became an assistant principal in 1997, and then in 2005, he became a principal. Outside of work, Keith was a devoted father to his 3 daughters, even after his divorce in 2003, and even after his promotion meant he had to move to a new city. Keith worked as a principal for about 6 years when, in November of 2011, he moved to the small town of Clymer, New York, to become the superintendent of their school district. This required Keith to move again 4 hours from where he had been living, but at this point, his daughters were all young adults, with the youngest away at college. Clymer is in the southwest corner of New York, just about 45 minutes from Erie, Pennsylvania. And it is a small school district. It literally has one school that serves all of the students pre-K through 12th grade, with about 350 kids total enrolled. Because the administrative offices are located on this singular school campus, Keith was around the kids a lot more than most superintendents are in larger districts. The school did have a principal, but Keith was still very hands-on, greeting the kids every morning during drop-off, and he quickly learned all of their names. Keith had recently turned 50 when he took this job, and it was the top of where he wanted to be. He was a superintendent. He loved the job, the small town, and the school, so he bought a very nice house on a bit of property, and he made plans to settle down in Clymer for the rest of his career. With his daughters grown, he made sure he had time to call them almost daily and visit them as much as possible, but he was also getting to live his life as an empty nester. Keith was a social guy, so he made friends in town from day one, and he also dated a bit. He had an on-again, off-again girlfriend named Kimberly, who he had dated for several years before he moved to Clymer. They even got engaged at one point, but called off the wedding in 2012 after yet another breakup. During their off times, both Keith and Kimberly would date other people, but in mid to late September 2012, it looked like they might start working things out again, or they were at least talking about it. Keith had a conference to go to in Saratoga Springs, which is clear across the state, out near Albany, and he suggested that Kimberly go with him. She agreed, but as the weekend approached, Keith didn't get back to her with the specific details. Even if Keith may have changed his mind about seeing Kimberly that weekend, we do know he was still supposed to go to this conference. So when the Clymer School principal drove by Keith's house on Saturday, September 22nd, 2012, around 10 a.m., he was surprised to see both of Keith's cars in the driveway. He made a mental note of it, thinking it was strange that Keith hadn't left town for the conference. The principal drove on, but he decided he'd stop in and check on Keith if the cars were still there when he passed back by the house later on. And they were, so he pulled up the driveway and entered the house through the garage. In there, he saw Keith's dog with the dog food tipped over, and this was strange because Keith usually had a dog sitter if he went out of town. The principal called through the house for Keith, getting no response, so then he tried to call Keith's cell phone and got no answer there either. That didn't sit well with him, but he decided to wait and see because there was nothing really obviously wrong. The next morning on Sunday, September 23rd, when the principal still couldn't reach Keith, he called over to the conference and found out that Keith never showed up. So he then called Keith's brother, Kevin. Kevin wasn't just his brother, he was also a former FBI agent. After confirming with Keith's daughters that they had not heard from him all weekend, which was strange because he called them almost daily, Kevin went to Keith's house and walked around. Like the principal, he didn't see anything wildly out of place. No one had broken in. The house was clean. There were no signs of a struggle. And it really just looked like Keith had walked out the front door. But Kevin saw some things that hit his investigative brain. For starters, we have Keith's wallet, which had a few $100s of cash in it. That was sitting right out on the counter. If Keith left the house willingly, why didn't he take his wallet with him? Then upstairs, Kevin saw a half-packed suitcase. It was open, and the other things Keith planned on packing were laid out. He just hadn't gotten around to finishing. Keith had a plan to leave for Saratoga Springs, which is a nearly 6-hour drive, on Friday evening. So if his suitcase was still just half-packed, it was probably in that state since Friday. It was now Sunday, and no one had heard from Keith between these 2 points in time. Kevin told those at the house to back up and leave. The principal said he remembered Kevin saying that this wasn't going to end well. And it took him off guard because they were worried about Keith, of course, but they thought maybe he fell while he was walking on his property and they just needed to find him. And they did do a search of the property as much as they could before it got dark, but Keith wasn't there. After Kevin did his walkthrough and everyone got out of the house, the police came to take a missing persons report. And when it got dark, they noticed something else strange. Keith's outside lights didn't come on. They checked and the light bulbs had been removed. That did not seem like something Keith would have done, only making Kevin more suspicious. The next day, on Monday morning, when it was light out, the police began a new search of Keith's property, this time with a scent dog. And very soon after starting this search, the dog led its handlers to 51-year-old Keith Reed's body, which was found just 50 feet from his driveway, hidden in the hedges. And I use the word hidden in a very active sense. Someone had dragged him to that spot to hide the location of his body. Keith's brother and parents were at the property when his body was found. His parents were parked in a car across the street, and when they learned what the police found, his mother was concerned that Keith was lying on the ground. She wanted to bring him a blanket because he must be cold. Kevin had worked for the FBI, and this was far from the first time he dealt with a crime scene, but he was in a tough spot. He had to tell her that she could not go over to Keith's body because this was an active crime scene. But remember, this wasn't a grieving mother. This was his grieving mother, and not for the first time. Kevin and Keith's sister died of cancer 12 years earlier. Keith's parents just lost a second child, and Kevin lost his remaining sibling. But he had to stay strong and steady for his parents. And then he had to do that for his nieces. He called Keith's daughters to tell them what happened, or at least what he knew about what happened, which wasn't much at that point, other than that it was clear Keith had been murdered. The autopsy would find that he was shot 3 times, once at close range. After shooting Keith, the killer tried to hide his body, not hide it forever because surely someone would come looking for Keith and search his property and find it, but they hid it just long enough to delay the investigation. And this person also tried to obscure some other evidence at the scene. Keith was shot 3 times, and these were all through and throughs. There was an entry wound and there was an exit wound. Initially, they didn't find any bullets at the scene. They eventually found one when they moved Keith's body and it fell out of his clothing, but the killer had collected the other 2. And it stands to reason they would have taken the 3rd one if they could find it, which they couldn't. And that's how the police knew Keith was shot with a .357. Building out the timeline of the weekend helped the investigators determine when Keith had been killed. In talking with his friends and family, they learned that Keith drove up to his daughter's campus on Friday, September 21st, to have lunch with her, and she said he was in a good mood and nothing seemed to be amiss. That evening, at dinner time, Keith went out to a private club with his friend, John. Keith was not a member of the club, but he was hoping to join, so he was there as John's guest. According to John, Keith seemed just fine that night, except he got a phone call on his cell phone at one point. Keith didn't answer it. He just looked at the phone, didn't look pleased, and ignored it. John asked Keith how things were going, and Keith said his job was wonderful, but that women suck. This club had cameras, so the police pulled the footage and saw Keith and John leave around 8:15. According to John, Keith said he planned to go home to finish packing and then drive late into the night to get to the conference. The drive from the club to Keith's house would have taken about 30 minutes at that time of night, so the investigators pulled security footage from a bank that he would have to drive past to get home. And right on schedule, Keith's car drove by. The investigators kept watching and waiting to see if another car came up behind him, thinking maybe Keith was being followed home. But there was no one behind him close enough to believe they were following him. Based on when Keith passed the bank camera, it seems he very likely got home right around 9 p.m., which lined up with something his neighbor said when the police knocked on their door looking for witnesses. They said that on Friday or Saturday night, they couldn't initially remember which it was, they heard 3 gunshots closer to their house than they were used to. This is rural New York, so hearing someone firing a gun wasn't completely unusual, but it was just closer to their house rather than sounding like it was out in the woods, which is why they made a note of it. Because Keith's wallet was found inside the house, it seems like he very likely made it back from dinner and into his home without issue. The killer, however, they believed, had unscrewed the light bulbs on the outside of the house, so it's possible they knocked on the door, or they made some sort of noise to get Keith's attention. But Keith wouldn't be able to just flip on the lights and see them. And without realizing he was being targeted by anyone, Keith thought nothing of opening his door and stepping outside. Crime scene techs did dust the light fixtures, hoping to get some fingerprints, but they didn't get any usable results. It had also rained the weekend that Keith was killed and left on his property, so it is possible there's other forensic evidence that was also unrecoverable. But they did find a receipt near Keith's body, just about 20 feet away. It was hard to read because it had gotten wet, but it was an ATM withdrawal slip for $240 from a bank in Virginia, a state that Keith had not been to recently. And it was time-stamped, so they knew this was not an old receipt. It was from September 21st at 12:30 a.m., so about 20 hours before they believed Keith was murdered. So what were the odds that someone who went to a bank in Virginia happened to be on Keith's rural property in New York on the day he was killed, and they're somehow not involved? I want to thank newspapers.com for once again sponsoring this podcast. I know that you devour all of the documentaries, you're binging the podcast episodes and series, but I can tell you from experience that you're not getting all of the information if you are not jumping into the newspapers. That is ground zero for case information, particularly if we're talking about older cases. Modern headlines are moving at lightning speed. So much gets buried on page 17 of an internet search, and you're just never going to see it. But with newspapers.com, you push past those polished retrospectives and you get the raw, unfiltered coverage from day one. You get all those details that somehow dropped out of retellings. Now, I love a good heist story, but maybe you're looking for an old case from your hometown that your grandma told you about, or maybe you want to see what the crime of the century, like the Lindbergh kidnapping, looked like to those experiencing it as it happened. We can all find what we're looking for over at newspapers.com. So if you're serious about true crime, stop waiting for the next episode to drop and start doing your own detective work. Newspapers.com is the ultimate archive for the armchair sleuth. Are you ready to see what the archives are hiding? Go to newspapers.com/truecrime and use the promo code Crimelines for 20% off your subscription. Newspapers.com, because the past always leaves a paper trail. I love to shop online. It is so easy and so convenient until I realize I am cozy in bed and my card is in my wallet across the house. But then I see there is that purple pay button, and I know it is going to be all right because that has my information already saved. I click a button and I'm ready to go. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. We're talking household names like Magic Spoon, Mattel, and Thrive Cosmetics, and even better, to brands just getting started, and you might be that next brand owner. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that help you establish an online store in line with your brand style and identity. And you're getting world-class expertise when it comes to managing inventory and international shipping and processing returns and all those other tasks that might be holding you back. Shopify can help with their award-winning 24/7 customer support anytime you get stuck and don't know what to do next. And as a customer, I will say I appreciate the ease of checkout with that purple button that lets me stay cozy in bed. See fewer carts go abandoned and more sales go with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 a month trial today at shopify.com/crimelines. Go to shopify.com/crimelines. Again, that's shopify.com/crimelines. The idea that the killer came up from the south also aligned with another piece of evidence the police had, and that was Keith's cell phone location. His cell phone was the only thing missing from the scene. Keith's ex-brother-in-law tried to call him after hearing he was missing, and he told the police that the phone was answered by a man who wasn't Keith. When the police traced the phone, they found that it last pinged off a tower 4.5 hours southeast of Clymer near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Whoever took Keith's phone headed down the highway in the direction of Virginia before they discarded it. Finding a cell phone in a large area like that would be like a needle in a haystack, except they figured out who answered the phone. It was a construction worker who was working on a bridge. He said he found the phone on a platform that had been built specifically so that workers could do this bridge project. The person who tossed it off the bridge probably assumed it was going to land in the water, and it would have, if not for the construction. The issue was that in thinking of people who would want to hurt Keith, there was no one in Virginia who came to mind. There was actually no one at all who came to mind for Keith's daughters. He never let them know he was having major conflict with anyone. The school principal did have the name of a family who had some type of issue with the school, but it was nothing that people would be homicidally angry over, or like Keith's death would somehow resolve this issue. Keith's brother Kevin, however, mentioned to the police that he did have this on-again, off-again girlfriend, Kimberly, and Kevin knew that Keith and Kimberly would fight a lot, and when they would break up, it was not amicable. And the recent text messages from Kimberly to Keith did look like they were arguing again. As I mentioned earlier, Keith invited Kimberly to go to that conference with him, but then never made final plans with her in the days leading up to the trip. Kimberly was not happy about this. There were angry voicemails and text messages about it, particularly when Keith then didn't return her phone calls. Kimberly also had a diploma at Keith's house that she wanted to get back, and she was also upset that he wasn't replying to her so that she could go get it. She even accused him of being busy with another woman. And something personal, like a romance gone wrong, would make some sense in the context of something else found at the scene. In Keith's bedroom, there was a picture frame that had the picture removed and the frame was left disassembled and face down. If this was personal, was it the killer who removed the photo? And if it was personal, Kimberly did make a good suspect. The investigators brought Kimberly in for an interview, and to her credit, she was very honest from what I have seen of the interview clips. She admitted she was angry at Keith that week. She said she would never hurt him and she loved him in spite of their tumultuous relationship, but she owned what she said in those text messages. She did not try to really downplay it. The police did try to do that thing where they pushed Kimberly to admit to something lesser, like maybe she did go to Keith's house on Friday night to get her diploma. And maybe she brought a friend along. They brought up a guy that she had been casually dating. And then words were exchanged between Keith and this other man, and maybe Kimberly saw something she didn't want to see, and maybe something happened that she didn't want to happen. Kimberly said, absolutely not. She had an alibi. If they were right that Keith was killed around 9 p.m. on Friday night when the neighbors heard the shots, Kimberly was in the clear. She was with her parents hours away and they could vouch for her, which they did. With an alibi, Kimberly was then put on the back burner while the police pursued another lead. They were getting calls from other school districts asking if they thought Keith was targeted because he was a school administrator. Basically, these other schools wanted to know if they needed to watch out. And of course, the investigators didn't have any evidence for or against that theory at that point, but they did have a man who turned up at the school hours before the shooting, and that seemed pretty relevant. All of this was caught on security cameras. It was around noon on Friday when this man approached the Clymer Central School. He tried to open the door, but it was, as schools tend to be these days, locked up tight. He looked like he was about to walk away before he approached the door again and looked inside. He got the attention of one of the school secretaries who came to the door to see what he wanted. The man said he was from Connecticut and he was planning on moving to the area. He had 2 master's degrees and he wanted to get an application to become a substitute teacher in the district. The man asked to speak to the superintendent, Keith Reed, so he was directed down to Keith's office. When he got there, he asked the receptionist if he could speak with Keith, but she said he was out of the building. The man asked some surface-level questions about the school and the area before he left with his application in hand. He never gave his name, and he didn't come back to school the next week to turn in that paperwork. This man was perfectly calm, and nothing seemed strange except that he was only there to pick up an application to be a sub and wanted to speak with the superintendent. That seemed a little like putting the cart before the horse, but nothing else made this guy stand out. While he was outside of the school on the security cameras, he did have sunglasses on, but they got a pretty good image of him when he was inside the building with his glasses off because he walked towards one of the security cameras as he left. This man was a solid lead, but they would have to get his face out there to the public and hope it got in front of someone who knew him. He could have been from the area, but he could have been from Harrisburg, where the phone was dumped, or Virginia, where the ATM receipt was printed. It might take some time to get his name if they had to take it to the media. But luckily for the police, they didn't have to wait because they got a phone call just days later. On Wednesday, 2 days after Keith's body was found, a woman named Mary Taglianetti called the police from her home in Virginia. She was very upset on this phone call, and she said she had just seen the news that Keith Reed had been murdered, and she was sure her husband had done it. Mary's name rang no bells for the investigators or for Keith's friends and family. They had no idea who this woman was or why her husband would want to kill Keith. But Mary's story with Keith actually started 2 years earlier, back in 2010. As Mary told pieces of her story to the police in New York over the phone, they sent an investigator in Virginia out to her house to bring her in for a recorded interview. And after Mary told them what she knew and what she suspected, they put her and her children in a hotel for their own safety. So let's back up to where the story started in the summer of 2010. Keith and Kimberly were on one of their off periods in their relationship, and Keith got on a dating app. Meanwhile, Mary and her husband, Anthony Robert Taglianetti, who went by Rob, were living in Virginia, where Rob was a historian with the Marines in Quantico. When Mary and Rob separated, she took their 4 kids to New York to live with her parents. Mary, newly separated and lonely, also got on a dating app, and that is how she and Keith met. Mary found Keith to be a very supportive person. He had been through his own divorce with children, and he knew what it was like. One night in the summer of 2010, they met up for dinner, had sex, and though they talked for a little bit longer, they never went out again. This was primarily an online relationship. It ended when Mary reconciled with her husband Rob and returned to Virginia, and Keith got back together with Kimberly. After Mary and Rob got back together, Mary told him that she had seen someone during their separation, but Rob said they could work through it. They also had other things to work on in their marriage, like Rob's temper, which had been a big factor in their initial separation. Things were better in the short term, but before long, old habits set in, and Mary was unhappy again. And that's when she got online, and in 2011, she started talking to another man. And then, in the spring of 2012, she decided to send Keith Reed a Facebook friend request. Keith did not accept that friend request, but he did message Mary to see how things were going. They started talking again, and Mary found Keith was once again a good listener, and someone who had good advice, as she told him that her marriage had not been going well. The friendly talk turned flirty, and then it turned outright sexual. They would email and talk on the phone, and Mary knew that Rob would be furious if he found out. This was definitely cheating. So she was pretty good about making sure she was cleaning up behind her, deleting emails from Keith as soon as she got them, and closing the windows on her accounts so nothing popped up unexpectedly. But then one day, in early August of 2012, Mary left the house for an appointment when Rob got onto their shared computer. And without even having to snoop, he saw an email. Mary hadn't closed out the window, and it was an email exchange between Mary and Keith that talked about some phone sex they had engaged in recently. When Mary got home, Rob confronted her and asked who Keith Reed was. Mary really had no choice but to confess, and she told Rob she was sorry. She did not want this to lead to a breakdown of their marriage. Mary later said it wasn't necessarily that she wanted to stay in the marriage for herself, but more so for her children. She knew the previous separation hadn't been easy for them, and she really didn't want to put them through it again. Rob wasn't sure where they were going to go from there, so he left for a few days and stayed with friends while he tried to decide what he wanted to do, and he eventually decided to return home. Mary promised to never speak to Keith again, and she gave Rob access to all of her accounts, which isn't uncommon in relationship repair after infidelity. But instead of using the email access as a sign of trust, Rob used it, according to Mary, as a way to get in contact with Keith, telling him to leave Mary alone or he'd be sorry. Rob threatened to put out the sexually charged messages Keith had sent to Mary, which would be, socially and professionally, rather embarrassing to him. And Rob warned Keith that he was messing with a former Marine. Mary actually did keep in some contact with Keith over the next few weeks using a new email address that Rob didn't know about, but that was even fading out leading up to Keith's murder. I think it's clear that Keith did not want to be part of their relationship drama because he eventually emailed Rob in late August saying not to contact him or threaten him again and, quote, tell your wife the same. Keith didn't let anyone in his life know that he was being threatened, and he didn't really change any of his habits. So it doesn't seem like he took Rob as much of a physical threat. The See No Evil episode on this case said that the police found handguns in various places in Keith's house, like maybe he was worried about self-defense. But then I read in his obituary that he was a member of the National Rifle Association. Someone whose membership in the NRA is notable enough to list it in their obituary, that's the type of person who would own multiple guns. I think if Keith really felt threatened, he would have told his brother, the former FBI agent, who would have advised him on what to do. But Mary said Rob was a threat to Keith, but she didn't fully realize it until the night of Thursday, September 20th, the day before Keith's murder. Rob was upset because he suspected that Mary had still been in contact with Keith, which she had, and he emailed Keith, quote, I will take action. I know where you are. I'm deadly serious. This is your last warning. And then he included Keith's address to prove that he did in fact know where he lived. Mary said that after he sent that email, Rob started getting dressed, but it was pretty late at night. It was after 10 p.m. She asked him where he was going, and he said, where do you think? Mary told Dateline that she said, you're going to see Keith, and he replied, I guess you know me. Mary thought there was no way he was actually going to drive all the way to New York from their home in Virginia just to fight someone. I mean, she wasn't really surprised he would try to fight Keith. She said he had a temper. He had been violent in the past, and physically confronting a man his wife cheated on him with definitely seemed possible. But surely, during the 6 hours of overnight driving, Rob would calm down, clear his head, and just come home. But just in case, Mary emailed Keith to warn him that Rob might be on his way up to New York to confront him. That email Mary sent was timestamped at 10:58 p.m. on Thursday night. Mary suggested Keith call in sick to work to avoid an embarrassing public confrontation. Keith never responded. In the meantime, Mary was also trying to get Rob to turn around and just come home by calling and texting him. Rob eventually replied to her hours later that he needed time to think so that he could stay mentally stable. But he said he would come home later because he promised to take their son to a museum on Saturday, and he wasn't going to let him down. Because Mary kept calling and texting Rob, his phone kept hitting towers, and the police were able to follow his travels as he drove up to the Clymer area and then south again back to his home. And they could see that Rob's phone and Keith's phone were traveling together, at least as far as Harrisburg. That's when Keith's phone stopped moving, but Rob's continued back to Virginia. Mary said she expected, at worst, that she was going to get a phone call on Friday from the police saying that Rob had shown up and caused a scene. Instead, Rob came home on Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and told Mary that he drove all the way to Clymer, but Keith was out of town, so he never ended up confronting him. When Rob got home, he did have a bruise on his head that he said was from banging it on a porch light. But otherwise, everything seemed okay. Relieved, Mary again reassured Rob that she wanted to make things right and fix their marriage. Rob then took their son to the museum like he promised he would do that day, and then he came home and went to bed early. On Sunday, Mary took the kids to church while Rob stayed home. She texted him again saying she wanted to work things out, and she suggested they try marriage counseling. But when Mary and the kids got home from church, she found that Rob had left. He wrote a note telling her that he was going camping to clear his head, and he left her some money for groceries. He said he would be back on Thursday. But instead of coming back on Thursday, he came back on Tuesday. He told Mary that he had quit his job, which his boss would later confirm, and then he took a shower before packing up some more stuff, and then he left again. It was on Wednesday that Mary decided to Google Keith's name because she wanted to know what Rob had found out about Keith when he did his own search. And of course, the first thing that came back were news articles about Keith's body being found on Monday and that they believed he had been shot on Friday night, the same night Rob would have been in Clymer. And that is when Mary called the police. The investigator showed Mary some still frames of the man who was up at the school on Friday afternoon asking for an application, and she immediately identified him as her husband, 42-year-old Anthony Robert Taglianetti. So the authorities issued a be on the lookout for Rob, and they held a press conference alerting the public that Rob was armed and dangerous. Knowing that Rob liked to camp in Shenandoah National Park, they began searching there. It turned out that Rob had gotten a citation that week from park rangers for having too many items at his campsite, so they knew they were on the right track. Rob was not at the campsite when they got there, so they patrolled the park and the roads around the park. And this worked quickly. On Friday, September 28th, Rob's car was spotted. He was pulled over and taken into custody without issue just 2 days after his wife had called in that tip. And in Rob's car, the police found a treasure trove of evidence. The biggest thing was that under the driver's seat was a gun case, and inside that gun case was a .357, the same type of gun as the suspected murder weapon. But they wouldn't have to rely on ballistics to try to match it. The gun actually had blood in the barrel, which would be matched to Keith Reed, and the chances of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 300 billion. And there was something else about the gun. The motive was found with it, literally. Rob had printed out the email thread between Keith and Mary that he found back in the beginning of August and wrapped it around the bloody gun. You might wonder why Rob didn't ditch the murder weapon immediately, and that is a good question. It looked like he may have been planning to get rid of it because weights were found in the back of his car, which could have been used for tossing the gun case into a lake, but for some reason, it wasn't something he had done yet. But that didn't mean Rob was not making moves to try to get away with this. The day after he left that note for Mary saying he was going camping, Rob filed for a replacement passport. He wrote that he planned to travel to Israel and he couldn't find his current one. And then on Rob's laptop, they found his plans for leaving the country. He bought a one-way ticket to Tel Aviv that would leave on October 12th, which would have given him enough time to get an expedited passport. Rob bought that ticket just hours before his arrest. As for the ATM receipt they found near Keith's body, it turned out that the withdrawal corresponded to one from one of Rob's accounts. It looked like, as he drove north to Clymer, he stopped at the ATM after midnight, probably to take out cash so he couldn't be traced through credit card transactions, buying gas and paying for food along his drive. After killing Keith, Rob then collected the bullets he could find and moved Keith's body to the brush, again doing things that would help him get away with this murder. One mistake he made was taking Keith's phone, and you'd wonder why someone who was trying to be careful would do something like that. The theory is that he took it so he could check for any messages, texts, or emails between Keith and Mary. When Rob saw enough, he threw the phone off the bridge on his way home, not realizing it didn't make it to the water. I have to say the evidence against Rob Taglianetti was pretty solid, but he decided to take this to trial, maintaining his innocence. The hardest part about this trial was finding a jury. This case was big news locally, and it was a small community. People talked. A lot of the evidence had been reported ahead of time, so a lot of people had their minds made up. But they finally found enough people, and the trial started in October of 2013. We've pretty much gone through the state's case already, so let's focus on the defense. I have to say that I thought the Dateline episode on this case presented the defense's case in a confusing way. So I was looking forward to firing up newspapers.com and getting into the reporting from the time to figure out what they were talking about. And that's when I learned it wasn't Dateline that was the problem, and it wasn't my understanding that was the problem. It was the defense. It was confusing because it wasn't very specific. One angle they took was painting Rob's, by then ex-wife Mary, as a liar and a manipulator, and said the jury couldn't believe anything she said. She wanted out of her marriage so she could be with Keith, and they accused her of leaving the email open on purpose so Rob would see it. Mary denied that from the stand. She said she wished she never left it open. Look where it led. But even if Mary did leave it open on purpose to try to get Rob to leave her, it hardly made her responsible for Keith's murder. Then the defense started painting this idea that Mary was framing Rob by accusing her of writing the angry emails to Keith and pretending they came from her husband. They pointed to one specifically from August 6, 2012, in which the email author wrote, quote, "Congratulations, you have destroyed our family. Do you know we have 4 kids? I am divorcing her. You better break it off because I will not handle seeing you ever. You would be effing with a former Marine," end quote. The defense's evidence that Rob didn't write this was the saying, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." And Marine Corps vets don't call themselves former Marines, which is pretty true in modern speech. But to weigh this evidence, I decided to do a little research on my own, and I read a lot of online threads between Marines about this exact thing, and it seems this is a more recent change. Up to the early 2000s, former Marine was acceptable and preferred over saying ex-Marine. And that would have been the case in 1994 when Rob finished his 4 years. Eventually, there was a change, and people stopped saying it because, yes, once a Marine, always a Marine. But people who were Marines before this change will still sometimes say former Marine. And saying that in 2012, no Marine Corps vet would use that term doesn't stand up to the many social media discussions on the topic that I read between Marines well after 2012. It just doesn't feel like a lot to hang a hat on. But let's go ahead and say Mary did send those emails and lied about Rob leaving the house angry. He still left the house, and he still went to Clymer. He's literally on video. So the defense was saying that, yes, he went all the way up there, and it was possible, within a reasonable doubt, that that same day, someone else happened to kill Keith, and the bloody gun found its way into Rob's car as he started making plans to leave the country. The gun, by the way, only had 2 DNA sources on it, Keith's and Rob's. It seems the only way for any of this to be true would be for Mary to somehow be involved, because she was the only one who knew Rob went up to New York that day. She would have access to his car and the gun to plant evidence if needed. But why would she do it? She wanted out of her marriage so badly that she set Rob up for the murder of the man she had feelings for. So now she doesn't have her husband, nor does she have the man she wanted to be with. Or did she think somehow Rob would confront Keith and Keith would win that altercation, even though Rob had a gun and was a good 10 years younger than Keith? It just doesn't make a lot of sense, and the defense wasn't really putting out a real solid alternative theory. It was more like looking for holes for the jury to cling to some type of reasonable doubt. And they did make some small points, like how it didn't look like Rob had a gun on him when he went to the school to confront Keith. But really, all that proves is that he didn't plan to shoot him at the school. And this was a second-degree murder case anyway. In New York, second-degree murder does not require the state to prove premeditation. They only have to prove intent. They had to prove that, 1, Rob fired the gun at Keith, and 2, killing him was his intent. I mean, the evidence of that was just overwhelming, and Anthony Robert Taglianetti was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Rob did appeal, and I thought I knew what this appeal was going to be for, but I was wrong. What I thought it was going to have to do with was the jury. After the trial, one of the jurors spoke to the Buffalo News about the deliberations. I read about it on newspapers.com, and I thought this interview would be grounds for an appeal. One of the jurors had also served in the military, just like Rob, and he said he thought the way Keith was killed was similar to how the military taught people to kill. The same juror pointed to something else that helped him come to his decision, and that was an email from mid-August where Mary told Keith that Rob had packed up his metal detector. The bullet found at the scene was copper, not lead, and while a metal detector will detect lead, lead doesn't give off as strong of a signal as copper. And we know the killer collected 2 of the bullets. So did Rob, a month later, still have a metal detector in his car? And did he use it at the scene to look for the bullets? I mean, maybe, but this feels a little outside the scope of the evidence. There was no testimony that I could see about military training regarding killing people, and there was no evidence, again, that I could find about the electrical conductivity of a lead versus copper. And this is a fine line that I'm not sure we've ever talked about here on Crime Lines. Obviously, jurors use their past experience to come to their verdict. It would be impossible for anyone not to. But it has to be general common sense type stuff. So let's say this was a poisoning case and somehow a pharmacist made it onto the jury. that pharmacist could not then use their quote-unquote expert knowledge to persuade other jurors if that same knowledge was not presented to them in court through an approved expert. So did this juror cross that line when talking about military training and how to kill people or how metal detectors work with the various metals? It's possible he did, or I would think so. So I was surprised it didn't make it into the appeal at all. For the record, I don't think that would have led to a successful appeal even if the juror did act inappropriately, because the evidence against Rob was so strong. If you take out the metal detector and the military training, there's still a very solid case there. And so that's probably why it didn't make it into the appeal. They would have to get the security footage from the school, the cell phone records, and the DNA on the gun kicked out before this verdict would go any other way. Unless Rob presented a different type of defense entirely, like an affirmative defense, saying that this was self-defense or maybe even an insanity defense. And that is more in line with what the appeal ended up being about. Prior to trial, the defense wanted to file a notice of intent to proffer psychiatric evidence. The state would then be allowed to submit an application to have the defendant evaluated, but it never got to that point because the court did not allow the defense to file their notice. The reason was that the filing was late. According to the New York statute, notice of intent to provide a mental health defense has to be served before the trial and no more than 30 days after the entry of a plea of not guilty. The law does say the court can permit a late filing at any time prior to the end of the trial if it is in the interest of justice and or good cause can be shown. So there is some discretion here. And the trial court said that Rob's defense did not show good cause to allow the delayed filing, which they tried to file more than 6 months after the deadline. If Rob was allowed to provide this psychiatric evidence, the defense could have been an extreme emotional disturbance defense. In New York, this is not the same thing as not guilty by reason of insanity. An EED defense is saying that the defendant acted under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance to the point that it is a reasonable excuse for their actions. It wouldn't lead to an acquittal, but rather a reduction in the charge, taking second-degree murder down to first-degree manslaughter. Because the trial court would not accept this filing, the defense went for a not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt verdict, rather than provide the evidence of Rob's mental state because they couldn't. So the appeal was saying that the trial court erred in not allowing the filing. As for the state, they argued to the appellate court that this defense never would have gotten Rob anywhere, even if it was allowed. Rob didn't find out his wife was having an online affair and then immediately and impulsively go attack Keith. He stewed about it for several weeks before leaving for New York after looking up Keith's address. He took out cash at the ATM so he didn't have to use his credit card on his drive, which was an over 12-hour round trip. He went to Keith's work with a cover story on why he was there, and when he couldn't find Keith at work, he waited several hours to confront him at his house. Rob was then careful to collect the bullets, conceal Keith's body, and go into hiding while he waited on his flight out of the country. That was a lot of calculation and deliberation for someone supposedly experiencing an extreme emotional disturbance. Being really angry, being really jealous, feeling betrayed, those things don't rise to the level of an EED defense. And the appellate court agreed. They found that Rob failed to show that this defense had any merit. The planning he did went against the elements of an EED defense, the main element being a loss of control. Rob seemed very much in control. Even if the court was incorrect in allowing it, there was no, quote, significant probability that the verdict would have been different. As of this recording in May of 2026, Rob Taglianetti is still behind bars. Since his appeal was denied in 2020, it doesn't appear there has been any other movement on the case, and I didn't see anything coming up on the New York appeal court docket. Assuming Rob is never granted post-conviction relief, he will remain imprisoned until at least September of 2037, which is his first possible parole date. He will be 67 years old.